What would you do if you had $9 left and a stranger needed 4 of them? That's the exact choice Whitney Foster faced on a rainy Tuesday night. She was 15, tired, standing alone at a bus stop after a 3-hour dishwashing shift, counting the last of her money in her palm. She needed every single cent to get home. But then she looked up. An elderly woman stood frozen at the fare machine, silver hair, trembling hands, $3.20 short. The last bus of the night was already pulling in. In 83 minutes, the next one would come, if the old woman was still okay by then. Whitney didn't pause. She didn't calculate. She didn't hesitate. She just walked up and gave the woman her money. That one small moment from a 15-year-old girl who couldn't afford to be generous changed everything. Yeah, sometimes the smallest choices end up changing everything. So let's start today's story. But to understand why that moment meant so much, you first need to understand what Whitney Foster's life looked like before it. Not dramatic, not devastating, just tight. In that very specific way where you always have just enough, and you learn early how to make just enough stretch. Whitney's alarm went off at 6:15 every morning. She shared a 2-bedroom apartment with her mother, Diane, on the east side of the city. Small place, clean, carefully maintained, the kind of clean that takes real effort when money is short. The walls had no art, but they had something better. Diane had pinned Whitney's graded school papers up there over the years. Every A, every teacher's note scrawled in the margin. Excellent work. Keep this up. You think differently than most students your age. Whitney had stopped noticing them a long time ago. Diane Foster was 40 years old and had been cleaning other people's houses for 15 years. She was good at her job and her clients liked her. She showed up on time, worked hard, and never complained. But 15 years of lifting, scrubbing, and carrying had left its mark. Her lower back hurt on most days. On bad days, it really hurt. She never said so directly. She'd just move a little slower, stand a little more carefully, and smile a little wider to make sure nobody noticed. Whitney noticed. She always noticed. On the kitchen wall, there was a monthly calendar with certain dates circled in red pen. Rent due, electricity bill, mom's back medication refill, bus pass reload. It wasn't a financial spreadsheet. It was just a calendar, but it told you everything you needed to know about how the Foster household operated. Carefully, deliberately, one circled date at a time. Some mornings, Diane would press $2 into Whitney's hand before she left for school. For the bus. I have money, Mom. Take it anyway. Whitney always took it. Neither of them said anything more about it. They both understood where that $2 came from and what it cost. 3 afternoons a week, after school, Whitney worked at a small diner 8 blocks from home. Technically, at 15, she couldn't wait tables or work the register, so she washed dishes, wiped down the prep counter, and helped restock whenever needed. It was legal, just barely, with the work permit her school helped her get. Mrs. Anderson, the owner, was a stout woman in her 50s who called everyone honey and meant it every single time. The pay wasn't much, but it was Whitney's. She used it for her own bus pass, her own school supplies, the occasional extra grocery run at the end of the month when Diane's paycheck hadn't arrived yet and the fridge was looking thin. She never framed it as helping her mother. In her mind, she was just not adding to the problem. That distinction mattered to her. At school, Whitney sat in the front row in Mr. Moore's English class. Calvin Moore was 62, retired once, then came back because he said he got bored. He had a habit of writing long notes in the margins of his students' essays. Not corrections, just thoughts. Conversations on paper. That week, he'd handed back a personal essay Whitney wrote about the city bus system. About how certain neighborhoods had 6 bus lines running through them, and certain neighborhoods had 1. And how that one detail shaped everything about where people could go, what jobs they could reach, what schools their kids could attend. Mr. Moore had written at the top, "You see systems where other students see scenery. Don't lose that." Whitney folded the paper and put it in her bag without showing anyone. At lunch, her best friend, Ronnie Wilson, dropped his tray across from her and launched immediately into a story about a video he'd seen. Some guy who helped a wealthy stranger and ended up getting a house. "I'm just saying," Ronnie said, mouth half full. "Being in the right place at the right time is a whole strategy." Whitney looked up from her food. "That's not a strategy. That's a lottery ticket." "Same thing." "It's really not." Ronnie pointed his fork at her. "If you ever meet a rich person out in the wild, please don't just walk away." Whitney smiled. "I'm not doing something good so I can get something back. That defeats the whole point." Ronnie stared at her for a long moment. "You're going to be broke forever," he said. She laughed. She didn't argue. She would think about that conversation later. Much later. That same afternoon, she came home between school and her work shift to grab her apron. Diane was on the sofa. She was usually at work by now. Whitney stopped in the doorway. "You okay?" "Just a little tired. I'm taking the afternoon off." Taking the afternoon off meant losing half a day's pay. Diane knew it. Whitney knew it. Neither of them said it out loud. Whitney went to the kitchen, opened the small book on the shelf where she kept her saved up cash, $4 she'd been setting aside all week for her bus pass reload. She took it, walked to the pharmacy on the corner, bought a box of cold medicine, came back and set it on the table next to a glass of water. Diane looked at the box, then at her daughter. "Where did you get money for that?" "I had some." Diane didn't push, but she looked at Whitney for a long moment with an expression that was equal parts gratitude and heartbreak. The look of a mother who knows exactly what her child gave up and knows her child will never admit it. Whitney grabbed her apron off the hook by the door. "I'll be home by 9, she said, and she left. That $4 was the last money she had until payday. She knew that when she spent it. She spent it anyway. The evening shift ended at 8 o'clock sharp. Mrs. Anderson pressed a small fold of bills into Whitney's hand on her way out. Tips from the dinner crowd, split the way she always split them, even though Whitney technically wasn't supposed to receive tips at her age. "Don't tell anyone," Mrs. Anderson said, the same thing she said every time. "Tell anyone what?" Whitney said, the same thing she said every time. She stepped outside. The air had changed since the afternoon. Heavier, colder, carrying that particular smell that comes right before rain. Whitney looked up at the sky and made a quick mental calculation. 8 blocks to the bus stop, 4-minute wait, 12-minute ride, home by 8:30. She could make that work. She counted her money as she walked. $3 from tips, plus the $6.40 she'd earned that shift, minus the $4 she'd spent on her mother's cold medicine that afternoon. Total, $5.40, plus the $4 already in her pocket from earlier in the week. $9.40. Enough for the bus home, enough for tomorrow morning's bus to school. A little left over. She exhaled. Okay, she could make that work. By the second block, the rain started. Light at first, the kind you think you can ignore. By the third block, it was steady, and she had no umbrella, because of course she didn't. She pulled her jacket tighter and walked faster, head down, watching the sidewalk pass under her shoes. She reached the bus stop at 8:07. The shelter had 3 other people in it. A man in a postal uniform scrolling his phone, a teenage boy with headphones, an older woman with grocery bags. Whitney slipped in under the roof and shook the rain off her jacket. The last bus of the night was due in 4 minutes. She leaned against the shelter wall and started counting her money again. Not because she'd forgotten the total, but because it was a habit. The kind you develop when getting the number wrong has real consequences. That was when she noticed the woman at the fare machine. Elderly, white hair pinned neatly back, a gray wool coat that was simple but well made. She stood with her back very straight, not the posture of someone in distress, but the posture of someone who had decided, somewhere along the way, that she would never look like she was in distress. She was checking her wallet, then her coat pocket, then the inner pocket of her bag, then her wallet again. Whitney watched for a moment. Something about the woman's stillness was unusual. Most people, when they can't find something, get flustered. Their movements get bigger and faster. This woman's movements stayed small and controlled, like she was solving a math problem rather than panicking. The bus rounded the corner 2 blocks away. Its headlights swept across the wet street. The driver's voice came through the half-open door. "You riding, ma'am?" The woman looked up. "I seem to be short. $3.20. "I can't hold the bus, ma'am. I'm sorry." "I understand." She said it simply. No argument, no pleading, just 2 words that accepted the situation with a dignity that made Whitney's chest tighten for reasons she couldn't immediately explain. The other passengers filed on. The postal worker, the boy with headphones, the woman with grocery bags. One by one, the shelter emptied out. Whitney stood there, doing the math she didn't want to do. $9.40. Bus fare home was $2.20. That left $7.20 for tomorrow. If she gave this woman $3.20, she'd have $4 left for tomorrow. Tight, but possible. If she gave her $4 even, just to be safe, she'd have $5.40. Still okay. She looked at the woman again, still standing at the fare machine, not looking around for help, not making eye contact with anyone, just standing there with that impossible stillness, waiting for the situation to resolve itself, the way you wait when you've learned that asking for help costs something too. Whitney recognized that. She had seen it on her mother's face more times than she could count. She wasn't thinking about the money she'd already given up that day. She wasn't thinking about the $4 that were supposed to be her bus pass reload. She wasn't adding things up or calculating risks or deciding whether this stranger deserved her help. She just walked up to the fare machine. "Ma'am, here." She held out $4. "Please take it." The woman turned and looked at her, a long, quiet look that Whitney couldn't quite read. "Are you sure?" Not a polite protest, a real question. "Yes, ma'am, I'm sure." The woman took the money. She didn't make a scene of it. No gushing, no grabbing Whitney's hands, no dramatic expression of disbelief. She simply said, "Thank you. That's very kind of you," and turned and stepped onto the bus. The doors closed. Whitney stood alone in the empty shelter as the bus pulled away into the rain. She looked down at the money still in her hand. $5.40, and 38 minutes of walking ahead of her. She zipped her jacket up to her chin and stepped out into the rain. The rain had no interest in letting up. Whitney walked with her head down, jacket hood pulled tight, shoes already soaking through at the toes. She ran the numbers in her head one more time, not anxiously, just practically. 5:40 left. Bus tomorrow morning was 2:20. That left 3:20. Enough for lunch if she skipped the drink. She could make that work. She had gotten good at making things work. 6 blocks in, she turned down a side street to cut under the awning of a closed laundromat, giving herself 30 seconds out of the rain. She stood there for a moment, catching her breath, watching the water run off the awning edge in a steady silver curtain. That was when she saw her, the same woman, sitting on the bench at a smaller bus stop halfway down the block, gray wool coat, silver hair, sitting with her ankles crossed and her bag on her lap, looking down at a phone with a completely dark screen. She pressed the power button once, twice, nothing. Whitney stood very still for a moment. Then she walked over. "Ma'am, did something happen? I thought you got on the bus." The woman looked up. No surprise on her face, just that same quiet composure. "I did. It let me off at the wrong stop. I was trying to look up my daughter's address, but my phone died." "Where does your daughter live?" 714 Westmore Circle. "I know the address by heart. I just can't get there from here without directions." Whitney pulled out her own phone. 14% battery. She opened the map and typed in Westmore Circle. 32 minutes on foot. She looked at the route. Then she looked up at the street sign, then back at the map. Westmore Circle was almost exactly on her way home. She'd passed within 3 blocks of it anyway. "I'll walk you there," Whitney said. The woman looked at her. "That's completely unnecessary. It's raining and your phone is dead and it's 8:30 at night." Whitney said it plainly, without drama. "I'm going that direction anyway." Another one of those long, quiet looks. The woman seemed to be taking inventory of something, not of Whitney's appearance, but of something else, something harder to name. "All right," she said finally. "Thank you." Whitney held out her hand to help the woman up. The woman accepted it without making it into a bigger moment than it was. She stood, straightened her coat, and picked up her bag. Whitney reached into the front pocket of her backpack. She'd forgotten she had it, a small folding umbrella she'd shoved in there after a rainy day 2 weeks ago and never taken out. She opened it and held it over the woman as they started walking. "You'll get wet," the woman said. "I'm already wet," Whitney said. They walked. Whitney adjusted her pace without thinking about it, shorter strides, steady, matching the older woman's rhythm. The rain fell around them and the street was mostly empty, and for a while, neither of them said anything. Just 2 people walking through a wet city at night, one of them holding an umbrella over the other. Then the woman spoke. "What's your name?" "Whitney." "How old are you, Whitney?" 15. A small pause. "You're out late for 15. "I work Tuesday evenings, dishwashing." She said it the way she said everything about her life. Matter of fact, without apology or performance. It was just true. "Where do you go to school?" "Jefferson High. I'm a sophomore." "Do you like it?" Whitney considered that. Most people who asked if she liked school weren't actually asking. They were just making conversation. But something about the way this woman asked made her feel like the answer genuinely mattered. "I like some of it," she said honestly. "I really like this one class. We wrote an essay about the city bus system, about how some neighborhoods have 6 lines and some have 1, and how that changes everything about what people can do with their lives." She paused, suddenly self-conscious. "That probably sounds boring." "It doesn't sound boring at all," the woman said. She was looking straight ahead, walking steadily through the rain. "What did you conclude in your essay?" Whitney blinked. Nobody had ever asked her that. "That the city makes decisions about who it thinks deserves to get somewhere," she said slowly. "And then it calls it infrastructure, like it's neutral. But it's not neutral. It's a choice." The woman was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's one of the sharpest observations I've heard about this city in a long time." Whitney didn't know what to do with that. She let it sit. They turned onto Westmore Circle 12 minutes later. The street was lined with large homes set back from the road. Not mansions exactly, but the kind of houses that spoke of old, settled, unflashy wealth. The kind of wealth that didn't need to announce itself. Number 714 was halfway down the block. Brick exterior, warm light in the windows, a porch light on, like someone had left it burning deliberately. Before they even reached the front path, the door opened. A woman in her mid-40s stood in the doorway, dark hair, wearing a blazer like she'd come straight from work, phone in hand. Her face shifted the moment she saw the older woman. Relief, and something close to anger, and relief again, all in about 2 seconds. "Mom, I've been calling you for an hour." She stopped, looked at Whitney standing there in the rain with a small umbrella. "Who is—" "This is Whitney," the older woman said. "She was kind enough to walk me home." The daughter, Patricia, stared at Whitney for a moment, then at her mother, processing. "Come inside," Patricia said immediately, stepping back. "Both of you, please, you're soaked." "I'm okay," Whitney said. "I just live a few blocks over. I should get home." "At least let me drive you. I'm really okay, honestly," Whitney smiled. "I'm glad she's home safe." She turned to go. Then the older woman's voice stopped her. "Whitney." She turned back. The woman was looking at her with that same measuring expression, steady, unhurried, like she was committing something to memory. Your mother's name is Diane Foster, isn't it? It wasn't a question. Whitney went completely still. The rain kept falling around her. Somewhere down the street, a car passed, its headlights sweeping briefly across the wet pavement. How do you know my mother? She asked. I know her name, the woman said quietly. I've heard it mentioned several times over the years, in contexts that mattered. She raised you well. A brief pause. She should be proud of you. The door closed softly. Whitney stood on the front path alone, rain falling, porch light going dark. She stood there for 10 full seconds before she remembered how to move. Then she walked the last 3 blocks home in the rain, turning the woman's words over and over in her head, and she still had no idea what any of it meant. Okay, hold up a second. This girl wakes up, buys medicine for her mom, gives away her bus fare, then walks in the rain, and later she sees that same woman stranded and still doesn't just walk past. 15 years old. And honestly, I honestly don't know if I would have done that. Whitney got home at 9:14. She unlocked the door quietly, the way she always did when she wasn't sure if her mother was asleep. The apartment was dim, just the living room lamp on low, the television murmuring softly in the corner. Diane was on the sofa, wrapped in a blanket, a half-empty glass of water on the table beside her. She'd been waiting. You're soaked. I'm okay. You walked. Not a question. Diane had learned to read her daughter's arrivals the way a sailor reads weather. The wet shoes, the damp jacket, the particular kind of tired that comes from walking a long way after a long day. Whitney sat down on the other end of the sofa and pulled off her shoes. Diane got up slowly, ignoring Whitney's gesture to stay put, and disappeared into the kitchen. A few minutes later, she came back with a bowl of soup she'd clearly made earlier and kept warm on the stove. She set it on the coffee table in front of Whitney without a word. This was their language. Not long conversations. Small acts repeated. Whitney ate, and then, between spoonfuls, she told her mother about the evening. Not all of it, just the shape of it. The woman at the fare machine, the $4, the walk, finding her stranded again, Westmore Circle. She knew your name, Whitney said. She said she'd heard it mentioned over the years, in contexts that mattered. That's exactly what she said. And then she said you raised me well. Diane had been listening with her usual stillness, but at that last sentence, something shifted in her expression, subtle, like a change in light. Did she tell you her name? Diane asked. No, I forgot to ask. Whitney shook her head. I forgot to ask, which is, I don't know why I didn't ask. She reached into her jacket pocket. Her fingers found something she hadn't put there, something small and stiff. She pulled it out, a card, thick, cream-colored, the kind of cardstock that has a slight weight to it when you hold it. It must have slipped out of the woman's bag when she was searching for her wallet at the bus stop and landed in Whitney's pocket without either of them noticing. She turned it over. Clean, simple, embossed lettering, no logo, no title, no decorative border, just a name and a number. Eleanor Hargrove. Hargrove Community Foundation. Whitney stared at it for a moment. Then she looked up at her mother. Have you ever heard of her? Diane reached over slowly and took the card from Whitney's hand. She held it under the lamp and read it. She read it again. Then she set it carefully on the coffee table, like it was something that needed to be handled with a certain amount of care. Whitney, she said quietly, where exactly did you say this woman was going? 714 Westmore Circle, her daughter's house. Diane nodded slowly. She was quiet for a long moment, looking at the card on the table. The Hargrove Foundation funds half the community programs in this city, she said finally. The after-school programs, the workforce training center on 5th, the health clinic that opened last year. Eleanor Hargrove built all of that. She's been doing it for decades. She paused. She's a very private person, very wealthy. She doesn't make the news much because she doesn't want to. Whitney looked at the card again, at the simple embossed name, at how ordinary it looked for what it apparently represented. I should return it, she said. I'll mail it back tomorrow. You should return it in person, Diane said. Mom, I'm just saying. Whitney picked up the card and set it on the kitchen counter before she went to bed. She wasn't thinking about what it might mean. She wasn't letting herself think about that. She had just helped someone get home safely. That was the whole story. That was enough. That should have been the end of it. A rainy Tuesday. A stranger helped home. A card to return. Life would go back to its usual rhythm. Alarm at 6:15, school, 3 afternoons at the diner, home by 9. Except the next 3 days didn't let it end. Wednesday at lunch, Whitney told Ronnie the short version. Woman at the bus stop, gave her the fare, walked her home in the rain. Ronnie put his fork down. Wait, Hargrove Foundation? He said it like she'd casually mentioned meeting the president. Whitney, you walked Eleanor Hargrove home in the rain. I walked an elderly woman home in the rain. There is a significant difference between those two sentences. Mr. Moore passed their table at that exact moment, coffee in hand. He slowed without fully stopping. Hargrove Foundation, he said, almost to himself. Then he looked at Whitney over the rim of his cup. They funded our school reading program 3 years ago. Without that grant, we would have lost the entire library budget. He nodded once. The nod he reserved for students who confirmed what he already suspected about them. Then he kept walking. Ronnie stared after him, then back at Whitney. Even Mr. Moore. It doesn't mean anything, Whitney said, but she thought about it on the walk home, more than she wanted to. Thursday evening, Mrs. Anderson called her to the front counter before her shift. A small envelope sat on top of the register. Whitney's name on the front. No return address. Hand-delivered that morning. Inside, 4 crisp dollar bills. Nothing else. No note. No explanation. Any idea who left it? Whitney asked. Man in a dark coat, Mrs. Anderson said. Asked if you worked here, left that, walked out. Ronnie appeared at her elbow. Okay, that's either very sweet or the beginning of a thriller. Whitney pocketed the money without answering. Friday lunch, an unknown number called. She almost let it go to voicemail. At the last second, she answered. The voice was warm, professional, unhurried. Is this Whitney Foster? My name is Audrey Johnson, executive assistant to Eleanor Hargrove. Mrs. Hargrove would like to invite you and your mother to meet with her this weekend. No obligation whatsoever. She'd simply like to thank you properly. Whitney said yes before she fully realized she was saying it. She hung up, stared at her phone. Ronnie appeared beside her. Who was that? Eleanor Hargrove's assistant. Ronnie dropped his entire lunch tray. The clatter echoed down the hallway. He didn't notice. It's just a thank you, Whitney said, mostly to herself. That's all this is. She said that 4 more times before Saturday morning. She didn't believe it any of those times. Saturday morning, Whitney put on her best clothes. That meant the dark jeans without the frayed hem and the white button-down she usually saved for school presentations. Diane wore her navy blazer, the one she kept pressed and hanging separately from everything else. They didn't talk much on the bus ride over, just sat side by side, watching the city pass through the window. The address Audrey had given them was a low brick building near downtown. Old, well-maintained, the kind of building that had been there long enough to stop trying to impress anyone. Inside, it was warm and quiet. Bookshelves along every wall, a window garden catching the morning light. 2 armchairs and a small sofa arranged around a coffee table like a living room rather than an office. Eleanor was already there. She stood when they entered, unhurried, deliberate. She looked exactly as she had on that rainy Tuesday night. Same composure, same steady eyes. "Whitney," she said. Then she looked at Diane. "And you must be Mrs. Foster. I'm very glad you came." Diane looked at her for a moment with the particular attention of someone trying to place a face they feel they should recognize. Then she sat down and folded her hands in her lap and said nothing, the way she did when she was paying close attention. Audrey brought coffee. They talked about small things first: school, the neighborhood, how long the Fosters had lived on the east side. Easy conversation, unhurried. Eleanor asked questions and actually listened to the answers, which Whitney was already learning was not as common as it should be. Then Eleanor set down her cup. "I want to tell you both something," she said, "and I hope you'll let me finish before you respond." Whitney nodded. Diane stayed still. "First, Tuesday night was completely real. My wallet was genuinely stolen. My phone genuinely died. I was genuinely stranded." She looked at Whitney directly. "What you did that night, you did for a stranger who actually needed help. I want you to know that clearly, because what I'm about to tell you could make it seem otherwise, and it wasn't otherwise." Whitney felt something in her chest loosen slightly, something she hadn't realized was tight. "But there is something I need to explain," Eleanor continued. "I know your mother's name, and it isn't a coincidence." The room went very quiet. Eleanor turned to Diane. "In November of 2019, you were working for the Aldrich family on Carroll Street. Do you remember that month?" Diane's expression didn't change, but her hands, folded in her lap, went very still. "Yes," she said quietly. "I remember." There was a storm, a serious one. The whole neighborhood was under an evacuation advisory. Margaret Aldrich was 87 years old, and she lived alone, and she was not able to leave on her own. Eleanor paused. "Everyone else left. You stayed through the entire night. You were not asked to. You were not paid extra. You simply stayed because she was alone and you didn't think it was right to leave her." Diane looked down at her hands. "Margaret told me that story many times over the years," Eleanor said. Her voice was measured but careful, the way you are careful with something that matters. She said it was the kindest thing anyone had ever done for her. Those were her exact words. She said it more than once. Whitney looked at her mother. Diane was sitting very straight, the way she always sat, but her jaw was tight and her eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with the morning light. "Margaret Aldrich passed away in the spring of 2021, Eleanor continued. "She was a close friend of mine for over 40 years. When she died, she left me a letter. In it, she included a list of names, people who had been genuinely kind to her over the years. Not family, not old friends. Ordinary people who showed up in small moments and chose to do the right thing when it would have been very easy not to." She looked at Diane steadily. "Your name was first on that list." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Diane brought one hand up slowly and pressed it to her mouth. She didn't make a sound. She just sat there with her hand over her mouth and her eyes very bright, absorbing something that had apparently been waiting 3 years to reach her. Whitney watched her mother and felt something she didn't have a word for, a feeling that was grief and pride and recognition all at once. She thought about that storm. She would have been 12. She remembered her mother coming home the next morning, exhausted, saying only that it had been a long night, nothing more. Whitney had never known why. "I have been trying to find a way to contact your family for over a year," Eleanor said, "but I couldn't determine how to do it without it feeling like charity, and I don't do charity." She let that land, then continued. "And then, Last Tuesday, your daughter appeared out of the rain and walked me home. And I thought, sometimes things resolve themselves in ways you couldn't have planned. She looked at Whitney with that same measuring expression that Whitney had been trying to decode since the moment they met. Now she understood what it was. It wasn't suspicion. It wasn't assessment. It was recognition. This is where the story turns. Everything Whitney thought was just a bad Tuesday night, the cold medicine, the bus fare, the walk in the rain, was actually the moment two families finally found each other. Stay with me, because what Eleanor puts on the table next changes everything. Eleanor reached to the side table and picked up a plain manila folder. She set it on the coffee table between them. She didn't open it yet. I want to be honest with you about something before I say anything else, she said. I'm not a sentimental person. I don't make decisions based on feelings. When I see something worth investing in, I invest in it, and I expect a return. Not a financial one necessarily, but a real one. She looked at Whitney. So when I tell you what I'm about to tell you, I want you to understand that it comes from that place, not from pity, not from guilt, not from wanting to feel good about myself. Whitney nodded slowly. I run a program, Eleanor said. It's called Pathways Forward. We've been running it quietly for 11 years through the foundation. It identifies young people, specifically from this city, specifically from under-resourced backgrounds, who show genuine intellectual ability and genuine character. Not one or the other, both. She paused. We fund them, completely, from wherever they are in their education, all the way through university. Tuition, books, transportation, testing fees, everything. Whitney went very still. In addition, Eleanor continued, participants receive a monthly living stipend during high school, $800 a month. It's designed so that the student doesn't need to work during the school year, so they can just be a student. $800 a month. Whitney did the math automatically, the way she always did math. That was more than she made in 3 months of dishwashing. That was her bus pass, her school supplies, the end-of-month grocery runs, all of it, and then some. That was her mother never having to press $2 into her hand in the morning again. She kept her face still. She had learned that from Diane. During the summers, Eleanor said, Pathway students participate in a mentorship placement, real work in a real professional environment in a field connected to their interests. She looked at Whitney. Based on what you told me Tuesday night about bus lines and infrastructure and the choices cities make about who deserves to get somewhere, I'd place you with our urban development team, alongside people who do exactly that kind of thinking for a living. Whitney thought about Mr. Moore's note. You see systems where other students see scenery. She thought about the essay she'd written and folded up and put in her bag without showing anyone. When you finish university, Eleanor said, there's a formal pathway. It's in the name, into the Foundation's Community Impact Division. It's not guaranteed. You'd have to earn it, the same way everyone else does. But the door is open. She finally opened the folder and slid it across the table toward Whitney and Diane. The numbers are all in there. I don't believe in vague offers. Diane leaned forward and looked at the first page. Whitney watched her mother's eyes move across the figures. Diane's expression didn't change, but she read the page twice, which told Whitney everything. There's something else, Eleanor said. She looked at Diane directly. Margaret's letter came with a small designated fund. She left it in my care, specifically to be used for someone on her list, at my discretion when I found the right moment. A pause. I'd like to use part of it to set up a care support account for you. It isn't large, but it would cover the days you need to rest your back without losing income. It's not charity. It was Margaret's wish, specifically, that the people on her list be taken care of. You're honoring her by accepting it. Diane looked at Eleanor for a long moment. The two women held each other's gaze across the coffee table. Two people of roughly the same age who had lived very different lives and were nonetheless, in this moment, completely legible to each other. I don't like accepting things I haven't earned, Diane said. I know, Eleanor said. Margaret said the same thing about you. Something moved across Diane's face. She looked back down at the folder. Whitney had been quiet through all of this, listening, absorbing, turning it over. Now she spoke. Can I ask you something honestly? Please, Eleanor said. If Tuesday night hadn't happened, if I'd just walked straight home and never seen you again, would I have ever heard about this program? Eleanor considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. She didn't answer immediately. Possibly, she said finally. Mr. Moore submitted a recommendation for you to our foundation 3 weeks ago. I would have read your file eventually. I might have moved forward. She paused. But I would have been reading about you on paper. I wouldn't have met you. And for me, that difference matters. I've learned not to invest in documents. I invest in people. She looked at Whitney steadily. Tuesday night, I met you. I watched you make 3 separate choices. The fair, the walk, the umbrella, when you had every practical reason not to. And I thought, I know exactly who this is. Whitney looked down at the folder in her lap. Her name was on the cover page, printed cleanly at the top. It had been prepared before today. This had been thought about, planned, made real before she even walked through the door. She looked at her mother. Diane was looking back at her with an expression Whitney recognized. The one that said, this is your decision, and I will support whatever you decide, and also, underneath that, very quietly, please say yes. Can I take this home and read it tonight? Whitney asked. Of course, Eleanor said. Take all the time you need. Whitney closed the folder, held it in both hands. I'll call you tomorrow, she said. She called that evening. She signed the papers on a Sunday afternoon at the kitchen table, her mother sitting across from her with 2 cups of coffee going cold between them. It was a quiet moment. No cameras, no celebration, just Whitney's pen moving across the bottom of the last page, and Diane reaching over and squeezing her hand once, briefly, before letting go. That was enough. The first thing Whitney did on Monday morning was tell Mrs. Anderson she was cutting back her hours. 1 shift a week, maybe 2, enough to stay connected, not enough to wear her down. Mrs. Anderson listened. Then she said, Good. You were always too smart to be here this much. She said it without any hurt in it, the way someone says a thing they've been waiting to say for a while. She handed Whitney a takeout container of soup for the road. You come eat here whenever you want. On the house. Always. Whitney hugged her. It surprised them both. She told Ronnie at school the next day. She kept it simple. Scholarship, foundation, urban development program. Ronnie sat across from her and listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which was so unlike him that Whitney actually stopped mid-sentence to check if he was okay. He was fine. He was just, for once, completely speechless. Then he said, I told you, right place, right time. That's not what happened, Whitney said. That's literally what happened. She let him have it. Some things weren't worth arguing. The first month without evening shifts felt strange. Whitney came home at 4 in the afternoon and sat at her desk, and the quiet of the apartment felt almost loud. She opened her textbooks. She did her homework without the particular tiredness that comes from doing it after a 3-hour shift. She read ahead. She went to bed before 10. Her grades improved so quickly that Mr. Moore pulled her aside after class in the 3rd week and said simply, There she is, like he'd been watching for her to arrive at something for a long time. She started the first summer mentorship placement at Hargrove Development in June. It was nothing like she expected and exactly like she'd hoped. Not a desk in the corner, not coffee runs and filing, real meetings, real projects, real conversations about how the city worked and who it worked for. Whitney sat in rooms with architects and city planners and community organizers and listened and asked questions and slowly, carefully started to understand the landscape she'd been living inside her whole life. In her third week, a senior planner was presenting a proposed transit corridor and asked the room if anyone had questions. Whitney raised her hand. She asked why the proposed route bypassed the eastern residential blocks, the same blocks she'd grown up in, even though the population density there was higher than the areas the route did serve. The room went quiet for a moment. The planner looked at his map, then at Whitney. "That's actually a very good question," he said. "The honest answer is that those blocks weren't prioritized in the original 2019 assessment, which probably needs to be revisited." Patricia Hargrove, sitting at the end of the table, wrote something down. She didn't say anything, but she wrote it down. At the end of the summer, Patricia's written evaluation of Whitney contained one line that Eleanor read twice. She walks into a room and looks for whoever isn't being served. Then she asks why. Diane, meanwhile, used the Care Support Fund the way it was intended, to rest on the days her back genuinely needed it without the dread of a missing day's pay. She took Tuesdays off. She slept in. She started cooking real meals again on weekday evenings, not just reheated things on tired nights. The apartment smelled different, better. One evening, Whitney came home to the smell of her mother's cooking and stood in the doorway for a moment before going in. Just standing there, absorbing it, the way you absorb something you hadn't realized you'd been missing. By the end of Whitney's sophomore year, the transit corridor question she'd raised in that meeting had made it into a formal community impact report submitted to the city. Her name wasn't on the document. The data was. Mr. Moore heard about it from someone on the city council. He found Whitney in the hallway the next morning. "I heard about the transit report," he said. Whitney looked up. "How did you hear about that?" He smiled. "Small city," he said, and kept walking. 2 years after that rainy Tuesday, Whitney Foster was 17 years old and had been accepted to the State University's Urban Planning program on a full Pathways Forward scholarship. The acceptance letter arrived on a Wednesday. Diane read it 3 times at the kitchen table, then folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope, and then took it out and read it again. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. That Friday evening, Whitney took the bus home from a late study session. Same route she'd always taken. Same stops, same turns, same view of the city sliding past the window in the dark. She got off at her usual stop. It was a Tuesday. It was raining. She almost laughed at that. She ducked under the shelter roof and shook the water off her jacket. And that was when she saw the girl. 13, maybe 14 years old, school uniform, a backpack that looked too heavy for her frame, standing at the fare machine, going through her pockets with the particular focused stillness of someone trying very hard not to look like they're panicking. Whitney watched for exactly 2 seconds, then she walked up. "Hey, how much do you need?" The girl looked up, cautious first, then something softer. "I'm like $2 short. I have most of it. Here." Whitney held out $2 without ceremony. "It's okay. I've been there." The girl took it. "Are you sure? I can pay you back. I go to Jefferson. I could." "Don't worry about it," Whitney smiled. "Just get home safe." The girl thanked her twice and got on the bus, and the doors closed, and the bus pulled away into the rain, the same way a bus had pulled away 2 years ago on a night that changed everything. Whitney stood under the shelter alone. She turned around and noticed for the first time that the shelter wall had a new poster on it. Hargrove Community Foundation. Clean design, simple text. At the bottom, a line she hadn't expected. Program Coordinator, Whitney Foster. She stared at it. She hadn't known they put her name on it. Nobody had mentioned that. She took a photo and sent it to her mother without any caption. 3 seconds later, her phone buzzed. Diane had sent back a single line. "I see it. I always knew." Whitney put her phone in her pocket and stood there in the rain for a moment, looking at her own name on the wall of the bus stop where it had all started. Then she walked home. 4 blocks. Same as always. Some things don't need to change. I want to tell you why I chose this story. Not because of the scholarship, not because of the twist, because of a 15-year-old black girl who had nothing left to give and gave anyway. No audience, no expectation, just a quiet choice that nobody was supposed to notice. Look, this is exactly why I chose this story. Because Whitney made me believe that quiet kindness still exists, even in a world full of prejudice, misunderstanding, all of that. And here's the thing, she had every reason not to help. Like seriously, every reason. But she helped anyway. That's the lesson. Real compassion, it doesn't need an audience to be real.